Hello everybody and welcome to my Postman Galaxy talk. My name is Philippe Ozil, I'm a developer advocate at Salesforce, and today I'm going to be presenting how you can share APIs at scale with a great developer experience. Before I jump into the presentation, I need to give you the forward-looking statement. I am working for a publicly traded company, so you need to make your buying decisions based on what is commercially available in the product. Not that I want to sell you Salesforce, but I have to give you this warning. Now, let's talk about what is of interest to us, the agenda. Today we're going to cover three things. First, I'm going to talk about enterprise scale software challenges. Then I'm going to present to you how you can build a great developer experience. And finally, I'm going to talk about a strategy to share APIs at scale. Let's start with enterprise scale software challenges. Before we discuss the challenges, let's first make sure we all understand what enterprise scale software is. And what this is typically a very large application, maybe a monolith of type ERP or CRM, that sits at the heart of an information system within an organization. And this is something with a lot of users, hundreds if not thousands of users, that has a lot of traffic typically, so millions of daily transactions if not billions, and 10 to hundreds of integrations with external facing or internal facing applications. So for example, you could have software like payroll that is controlled with this internal system, or you can also have something like external websites that are also hooked to this enterprise scale software. And so all of these integrations and all of these constraints dictate the way we can use APIs with these systems. Typically, there are some constraints that are the following. There are multiple authentication modes that need to be supported because within an organization there's typically already a single sign-on or a way to provide identity of the users and their authorizations. So things like OAuth, SAML, OpenID, and others. Active Directory, for instance. Anyway, all of these things are also versioned. Typically, enterprise scale software is inside a company and inside an organization for a long duration. It's not something you change every day. So this means that it needs to support legacy integrations, and there's a risk that every breaking change impacts some other software. So what happens in this case is that typically the APIs that are exposed by this enterprise scale software are versioned, and there's a long-lasting support. So for example, Salesforce support APIs that are more than 10-year-old, and these APIs are actually still in use by some of our customers. There's a reason why we support them. So this is kind of the constraints you have to deal with. And one of the last constraints I want to highlight also is the customer-specific API signatures. And let me explain a bit what I mean by that. So I'm going to take an example to illustrate that. Let's take, for example, two customers, customer A and customer B. Customer B has the same software as customer A, but these two have very different businesses. So for example, customer A has an airline company, and customer B is, for example, a car rental company. And so when they install the software, say a Salesforce or another, for instance, they benefit from some standard objects that are exposed through REST resources. And if I take one of these standard objects, for example, the account object, this account object has a set of standard fields like a name, a type, and maybe a billing and shipping address and some other fields. But these fields can be extended with custom fields. And of course, customer A will have his own use case, customer B will have his own other use case. So these objects can be extended, but that's not all. Of course, maybe the two companies or the two customers want very different things. So they can create also custom objects on top of these standard objects. And as they create those custom objects, plane for customer A and car for customer B, they're able to add their own set of fields to these custom objects. So you can see that each time they do that, they modify the API signature because these custom objects are also exposed as REST resources. But it doesn't stop there. There's also another thing that is coming up. Typically, enterprise scale software offers a dynamic scripting language that allows us to put configuration one step further. And what they do is allow customers to build their own REST endpoints or other types of endpoints, but custom endpoints, that's the main point. And by building those custom endpoints, they're able to serve custom business logic. So for example, customer A will be able to serve a get endpoint that exposes a trip summary that mixes different objects like a plane, airports, and connections, things like that. And maybe customer B would do something else like allow a specific post URL to allow the creation of a report. So that's really different use cases, but these are all part of the overall API signature of these customers. And so this is a real challenge to be able to reconciliate all of these different use cases which are private to each customer and serve a tool that works with all of that. So how do you address that? Well, let's talk about how you provide a modern developer experience to support these kind of use cases. So before we go into depth of what is possible, I want to just tell you something that you probably already know, but modern experience has really evolved recently, and what used to be fine in the days is no longer really the best cutting edge technology or experience, I would say. So in the days, having a single static documentation was perfectly fine, and everybody could use it. That was great. But nowadays we have better tools and we have stronger expectations from developers. One of them is, for example, the ability to have a dynamic and personalized documentation. So what this means is that the developer wants to be able to sign into the documentation experience, and he wants to see only documentation maybe for the modules or products he has access to. He also wants to see his own customizations on top of the standard documentation. So if I take the example that I just gave you with the custom REST endpoints, these REST endpoints are also documented on top of the standard REST endpoints. And so they want a unified view of all the documentation, the standard one and the custom one that is specific to their organization. Another thing that is also typical from the modern developer experience is the ability to execute some requests directly from within the documentation. So maybe you have some code samples as a start, but developers want to be able to customize that code sample and try it on the fly. So maybe they want to check, for example, the format of an answer, of a response of one of these APIs. And not only that, maybe you want also to collaborate with those code samples or request samples. And instead of typically copy pasting all the URLs parameters in an email or through a chat window, they want to be able to send, for example, a shareable link or something like that. And finally, as well as trying out the documentation, we want to be able to generate some content out of it. So maybe they need often the same operation. Maybe they want simply a simple code generator out of it for different languages, for instance, like PHP, JavaScript, or whatever. All of these little small features, and I'm just giving you some examples here, there are many more. All of these features really are what shapes a modern developer experience. And you'll see that Postman has quite a few of these things, so that's a great tool to build a modern developer experience. So let me tell you now a bit of history, what we had at Salesforce and what typically used to be a great developer experience but is no longer really bleeding edge. In 2008, our community built something called Workbench with a tool called the REST Explorer, which lets developers explore and call some REST APIs for Salesforce. And this was really a revolution in its time. This actually predates the creation of Postman. And that was a great tool. It was used for many years and it's still in use today. But you can see the UI and you can see the features. It's no longer cutting edge in regards to current technology. So there's some things that are missing. Like for example, there's no persistence. You're not able to save requests or parameter values. It's also a single individual environment. You're not sharing anything with any of your colleagues. There's no way to send a request to one of your colleagues except copying the parameters. And also it is very hard for us to maintain as a company. So this is why we're actually moving to Postman. And you can see the little red banner on top there telling the story that we're actually moving away from this tool to adopt Postman, because this is really a tool that is meant to serve a modern developer experience. So part of this modern developer experience starts with onboarding, and onboarding is really critical here. If you miss the first impression for your developers, you're probably sending the wrong message. So one thing that is really important when you want to onboard a developer is documentation. And the first thing, of course, you'll think naturally about documentation is API documentation, but that's not the only thing you need to document. Typically, you also want to document setup, the tooling setup to get access to your APIs. And something I found by talking to a lot of my community members is that Postman is a super powerful tool, but one thing that it lacks is an easy path for beginners. And it can be very intimidating for people who have never used the tool. And so developers may be interested in your APIs, but they don't know yet about Postman. So you need to give them a guided tour or step-by-step instructions in order to execute the first request on your APIs. And one thing that is important here, that I want to stress out, is that not all the developers use the same tool, and so you want to be able to cover the different paths. And for Postman, this means that some people will use the desktop app, but also they will use the new web UI as well. And I'm going to cover why this is really important in enterprise scale software. So the web UI is really a lifesaver here for enterprise access, because we evolve in different constraints than typical enterprises. The reason for this is that enterprise software is typically used by large organizations, and these large organizations have very strict security policies in place. And one of them, which is generally the dread of developers, is called application whitelisting. And this means that you're generally not an administrator on your machine, so you cannot decide which application you're allowed to install or not. And generally, people need to find tickets, and they may be asked a lot of questions about what kind of software they install. So it can be a real blocker not to be able to install development tools as they need them. And the good news is that with Postman, since a couple of months, we have the option now to use the website, the Postman Web UI, with the same kind of features as the desktop app. And this is a great way to get away from the application whitelisting requirements. Here we have an example of a query that I ran on Salesforce from the web UI. That's very powerful. You could do the same thing, of course, with the desktop UI, but this is a great way to run queries without having to install anything. So there's one thing, however, you have to keep in mind when you want to offer this capability, and I think it's really important when I talk about this. It's cross-origin resource sharing. And that's something that is really important to understand if you want to allow your developers to use your APIs for your product. You need to handle CORS correctly. So let's say your server sits on a specific domain, .whatever.com, and if your developers are using the Postman app, they are going to send HTTP requests to your server. That's fine, this will work, there's no problem. But when they use the web UI, they're in a different context. They're also using HTTP, but they're using HTTP within the context of a browser. And this has a strong impact because it enforces CORS validation, or cross-origin resource sharing validation. And what this means is that the Postman Web UI is typically residing in a .postman.com or .postman.co domain, but it's trying to access another domain, the .whatever.com. And so in order to accept responses from that other domain, it needs to have some specific HTTP headers in the responses. And that's called the access control allow origin header. And so this is something you need to control on your server to make the web UI work for Postman. I want to really make this a strong statement here because it's just a small parameter configuration you need to do on your server, but it opens the door to a lot of features on Postman, and it will typically unlock productivity for developers that are restricted with application whitelisting. Now that I've covered that part, let me talk to you about another thing that is also critical for large organizations. Because they have strong security, you want to make sure that you ship your collection or your Postman resources with security in mind. And one of the things that security teams hate or are really not pleased at with Postman is the fact that Postman stores credentials without hiding them. So if you have access to the owner of the machine, you'll be able to look at the safe credentials if they're stored in environmental variables or collection variables. And a great way to avoid storing credentials on your machine, is to use an OAuth scheme. That's one of the many authentication formats there are, but this one is interesting because it requires a web browser. And so whether you're on the desktop app or on the web UI, this basically pops up a login dialog when you need to access the application. This web dialog is just something that is temporary. You just fill in your authentication and closes, and it sends you back an authentication token that you can use to call your APIs. That's just a small thing, but it's super important because if you use this kind of authentication flow, Postman will not keep the credentials, and that's great. Now let me talk about a scalable strategy for sharing APIs. So the first word of advice I have for you is start small and dream big. So what I mean by that is that you should start with a small collection. No need to get 100% coverage yet, no need to provide entire documentation. Start with something small. First, consider the basic authentication options and the most frequent operations to start with. And then you can release early a pilot or a beta to selected users. And starting from there, you can iterate on asking them where are the priorities, what you could improve, things like that. It's never a good thing to just wait to have everything ready to ship, because maybe you missed something very important about the user's use case, and you better ship as early as possible. And one thing we did in addition to that strategy is something important you need to remember. You're not alone when you build these APIs. You're one of the stakeholders, but also your users are stakeholders. And so building these APIs with Postman or with another tool requires a lot of time and resources. And there are some people that are really willing to help. And these people are sitting next to you. These are your community members. And so it's a great thing if you can to leverage open source to allow them to contribute to the process. And that's what we did at Salesforce. We leveraged community contributions to go faster and to build our API collection on Postman pretty faster. So we started with a different process. At first, we weren't fully on Postman at the time. We had a mix actually with a Postman backup dump, a GitHub repository, and some sort of transformation script. So that worked, but was suboptimal. The good news is that Postman released a great new feature that leverages public workspaces to make this collaboration process really fluent and easy to handle. So let me share a bit how this works. It starts from the main collection that is hosted on a public workspace. And from there, users are able to use the same collaboration process as they would if they were using Git, for instance. So they're able to fork the main collection to keep a copy of their own so that they can modify it and work in their own environment. And let's say, for example, user 1 makes some change to his fork, he can then do pull requests to submit his changes back to the collection owner. The collection owner can review the changes, maybe make some comments, request some additional changes, and at some point, when he's happy with those changes, he can actually merge them in the main collection. And at this point, user 2 is able to update his own collection by pulling from the main collection to get the updates that user 1 did. So this is a typical Git collaboration flow, but this is now applied to Postman. You can do everything, all of these operations within Postman, and it's a great change. This allows people who do not belong to your organization to contribute to your API collection, and that's a really good win. We've been leveraging that at Salesforce with a lot of success. Now, one thing I want to give you as a piece of advice as well is to maximize your collection visibility. And so to do that, you need to work on two fronts. You need to publish in two environments. First of all, you want to publish on a public workspace because you want to gain access to this open source type of contribution collaboration mechanism. And here you can see screenshots of how you'd be able to pull changes into your collection, how you would be able also to review some pull requests. But you don't want to do that only. You also want to use the API network, the Postman API network. Why is that? Well, because this is way simpler to install your collection from the API network, and it's also way more visible if it's on the API network, because people will look at it by doing a search there first. So it's the same collection, but you can publish it in two different environments. The only downside of using the API network only is that you'll not be able to pull in changes from a collection that has been installed with the API network. That's just a little downside of it, But you can easily point to some documentation that highlights this if people get to your collection through the API network, so they can actually install it as a fork. Let's now talk about the future steps. Now that you have a API collection ready and you have some documentation, you probably want to move to the next step. And the next step is probably to look at OpenAPI 3.0 specification, or OAS in short. OAS is a standard that is used to describe RESTful APIs, and that can be consumed by human as well as other machines. And what is so interesting with this OAS schema is that you can use it to generate customer-specific documentation. So this is a great way to handle customer-specific API signatures. If you already generate a schema for that, you can serve documentation with it. But you can also provide the schema for different use cases. First of all, this schema can be consumed by Postman. So instead of leveraging an API that is a standard API from Postman, you can generate a customer-specific API in Postman just with a single file. Not only that, but you can also use the same schema file to simplify and automate part of the auto integrations with third-party systems. So for example, in Salesforce, we have a tool called external services, and this external services consumes a JSON file that contains an OAS specification, and it's able to generate automatically a set of wizards that let you plug in a third-party solution. That without any code, so that's pretty powerful. And there are a lot of tools which leverage this technology, so that's really a recommendation I have for you. Alright, that's now time for me to conclude. So again, I want to highlight the key points of my talk today. You want to really start small and iterate with the help of your community. Remember, you're not alone. There are a lot of people who have interests in you succeeding and making your documentation as transparent as possible. So if you can, open source everything. That's my recommendation. Now, another thing that is also super important and you want to spend a lot of efforts on is making sure that you have a great onboarding experience with clear setup instructions so that people are giving a nice journey to learn about your APIs. And it starts really from this tooling setup. Then you want to make sure that you work on different fronts at the same time. I know it's a lot of effort, but there are some things you should not neglect. So you want, for example, to provide installation instruction and support for both the desktop application as well as the web UI experience for the reasons we've gave you, security restrictions. And you also want to work both on public workspaces and on the API network. The more you do, the more visible your APIs are, and the greater your chances of success will be. All right, that's my closing remarks for today. If you want to check out how we did that for Salesforce, feel free to check out our API collection, which is on postman.com/salesforce-developers. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone. Bye.